She treated the homeless man with kindness. He was actually a duke. Picture this, a bustling city street on a cold November morning, where thousands of people rush past each other without a second glance. The autumn wind carries the scent of fallen leaves mixed with exhaust fumes and the distant aroma of coffee from street vendors. It's the kind of place where anonymity is a currency and indifference is the norm. But sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, humanity reveals its truest colors. Our story begins with Elena Moro, a 28-year-old pediatric nurse who worked the night shift at St. Catherine's Children's Hospital. Elena wasn't wealthy, far from it. After paying rent on her tiny studio apartment and sending money to help her elderly mother in the countryside, she barely had enough left for groceries. Her apartment was a testament to her priorities: medical textbooks stacked on every surface, a small kitchen table that doubled as her study desk, and photos of the children she'd helped care for over the years covering one entire wall. But Elena possessed something money couldn't buy: a heart that refused to ignore suffering. Elena had grown up in a small farming community where neighbors looked out for each other, where her grandmother had taught her that kindness was the only currency that truly mattered. When Elena was 12, her father had been diagnosed with cancer, and the entire community had rallied around their family, bringing food, helping with medical bills, and ensuring that Elena could continue her education. Her father had passed away when she was 16, but not before making her promise to use her intelligence and compassion to help others. That promise had driven her through nursing school, through the financial struggles that followed, and through every difficult shift at the hospital. On this particular morning, as Elena walked home from another exhausting 12-hour shift, her feet aching in worn sneakers that she couldn't afford to replace, she noticed him. Sitting on the steps of an old cathedral, hunched over with his head in his hands, was a man who appeared to be in his early 30s. His clothes were torn and dirty, his black hair unkempt and falling across his face like a dark curtain. What struck Elena most wasn't his appearance, it was how everyone else seemed to make him invisible. Businesspeople in expensive suits stepped around him as if he were an obstacle, their conversations about stock prices and lunch meetings continuing without pause. A group of college students laughed loudly as they passed, one of them making a cruel comment about cleaning up the streets, while another took a photo, probably for social media. Even a police officer walked by without acknowledgement, his attention focused on his radio. The morning rush hour flowed around this man like water around a stone, leaving him isolated in a sea of humanity. But Elena saw something different. Maybe it was her training as a nurse, where she'd learned to look beyond surface appearances to find the person underneath, or perhaps it was the way he held himself despite the ragged clothes. There was something dignified about his posture, something that didn't quite fit the image of someone who'd given up on life. His hands, though dirty, were long-fingered and elegant. Even in his despair, he sat with a straightness to his spine that spoke of good breeding and education. She approached slowly, her nursing bag heavy on her shoulder, noticing how he tensed as her shadow fell across him. When he looked up, Elena found herself staring into the most striking pair of dark eyes she'd ever seen. They were intelligent, watchful, and carried a depth that spoke of experiences far beyond anything she could imagine. These weren't the hollow, defeated eyes she sometimes saw in patients who had given up hope. These eyes held pain, yes, but also a fierce intelligence and something that looked almost like nobility. "Excuse me," Elena said softly, crouching down to his level despite the fact that her knees protested after the long shift. "Are you all right?" The man, who we'll later learn was Alexander Blackwood, the Duke of Ravenshaw, studied her face carefully. In his 31 years, he had learned to read people quickly. As a duke, he had been approached by countless individuals who wanted something: money, favors, influence, or simply the prestige of being associated with nobility. Most who approached him in his current state wanted something else entirely: a story for social media, the satisfaction of feeling superior, or worse, they saw him as an opportunity to demonstrate their charity for others to witness. But Elena's eyes held only genuine concern, untainted by any ulterior motive. "I'm fine," he replied, his voice carrying an unexpectedly refined accent that made Elena pause. There was something about the way he spoke, a precision and education that seemed at odds with his current circumstances. "When did you last eat?" she asked, ignoring his deflection. Elena had learned in her years of nursing that people in crisis often claimed to be fine when they were anything but. Alexander hesitated. The truth was, he hadn't eaten in 2 days. This experiment, living on the streets to understand the crisis affecting his duchy, had proven more challenging than he'd anticipated. He had thought he understood poverty from reading reports and statistics, but the reality of hunger, of cold, of being invisible to society was beyond anything he had imagined. But admitting hunger felt like admitting failure, and Alexander Blackwood was not accustomed to failure. Elena didn't wait for an answer. She had seen that hesitation before in patients' family members who were too proud to admit they needed help. She reached into her purse and pulled out a wrapped sandwich and a bottle of water, her own lunch that she'd packed for the walk home. The sandwich was simple, peanut butter and jelly on bread she'd gotten on sale, but it was made with care and meant to sustain her until her next paycheck. "Please," she said, extending the food toward him. "I work at the hospital across town. I see people who are struggling every day, and I know that sometimes we all need help." What happened next surprised them both. Instead of taking the food immediately, Alexander asked, "What about your lunch?" The question revealed something about his character that even weeks of living on the streets hadn't changed. Despite his own desperate need, his first concern was for her welfare. Elena smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had directed at him in weeks. It was radiant and warm, transforming her tired face and making her eyes sparkle. "I can grab something at home, but you're here now and you need this." As Alexander accepted the sandwich, their fingers brushed briefly. Elena felt an unexpected jolt, not just of sympathy, but of something deeper, something that made her pulse quicken in a way she hadn't felt in years. And Alexander found himself looking into the face of someone who saw him not as a title or a problem to be solved, but simply as a human being in need. For a moment, the masks they both wore, hers of professional competence and his of noble authority, slipped away, and they saw each other clearly. "Thank you," he said, and the gratitude in his voice was so profound that Elena felt tears prick her eyes. She had heard gratitude before from patients and their families, but this was different. This came from somewhere deep and genuine. "I'm Elena," she offered, settling more comfortably beside him on the cold stone steps. "Alexander," he replied, using his real first name because something about her made deception feel wrong. He found himself wanting to tell her everything about his title, his responsibilities, his mission here on the streets, but he held back. Not yet. Not until he understood what this feeling was that was blooming in his chest. As Elena stood to leave, her shift bag feeling heavier now as exhaustion set in, she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "I walk this route every morning after my shift. If you're still around tomorrow, I'll bring you something warm." Alexander watched her walk away, her worn sneakers and tired shoulders telling the story of someone who gave more than she had. He noticed the way she moved, with purpose despite her exhaustion, and the way she had spoken to him, not with pity but with genuine respect. He had no way of knowing that Elena had just spent her last $10 on dinner the night before, or that the sandwich she'd given him was meant to be her only meal until her next paycheck came in 3 days. But Elena didn't hesitate. As she climbed the 3 flights to her small apartment, she was already planning what she could bring him tomorrow. She had a can of soup in her cupboard, and she could make extra coffee in her thermos. As she lay in bed that afternoon, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, she found herself thinking about Alexander's eyes and wondering what story they held. Those weren't the eyes of someone born to the streets. There was education there, intelligence, and pain that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than just physical hardship. She had no idea that those eyes belonged to one of the most powerful men in Europe, someone whose decisions affected millions of lives, someone who was currently missing from his duties while conducting the most important investigation of his life. Alexander Blackwood owned castles and estates across 3 countries, commanded the loyalty of thousands of subjects, and had wealth that could buy almost anything. Yet sitting on those cathedral steps, receiving kindness from a stranger, he felt richer than he ever had in his palaces. Because Alexander Blackwood wasn't just any duke, he was a reformer, a man who had inherited not just a title but a responsibility he took seriously. When his father had died 5 years earlier, Alexander had inherited a duchy in crisis. Unemployment was rising, homelessness was becoming epidemic, and his council of advisors, led by his own cousin Vincent Blackwood, seemed more interested in maintaining their own wealth and power than in addressing these problems. For months, Alexander had been fighting to pass legislation that would address homelessness and poverty in his region. He had proposed job creation programs, affordable housing initiatives, and healthcare reforms that would help the most vulnerable in his society. But the Noble Council, led by his own cousin Vincent Blackwood, had blocked every proposal, claiming Alexander didn't understand real poverty and was too idealistic to govern effectively. Vincent had been particularly vocal in his opposition, arguing in council meetings that Alexander's proposals were financially irresponsible and would bankrupt the duchy. "You can't save everyone, Alexander," Vincent had said just weeks before, his voice dripping with condescension. Some people are poor because they choose to be. You can't throw money at every sob story that crosses your desk. So Alexander had done something unprecedented. He had dismissed his security detail, shed his noble garments, and taken to the streets to experience firsthand what his people were facing. He had told his personal secretary that he was taking a private retreat and was not to be disturbed for any reason short of a national emergency. What he found in those first weeks was worse than any report had indicated. He had slept in doorways, been moved along by police, experienced the gnawing pain of hunger and the bitter cold of November nights. And now, through Elena's simple act of kindness, he was beginning to understand something else, that compassion wasn't about grand gestures or royal decrees. Sometimes it was just about seeing another person's humanity and responding with whatever you had to give, even if it wasn't much. True to her word, Elena returned the next morning, this time carrying a thermos of hot soup and a thick blanket she'd taken from her own bed. She had spent the previous evening making the soup from scratch, using vegetables that were starting to wilt and a chicken breast she'd been saving for her own dinner. The blanket was one her grandmother had made for her when she left for college, soft and warm, and carrying the faint scent of the lavender sachets her grandmother had always used. But as she approached the cathedral steps, she found them empty. Her heart sank. Had Alexander moved on, or worse, had something happened to him? The morning was colder than usual, and she worried about where he might have spent the night. Looking for someone, came a voice from behind her. Elena turned to find Alexander emerging from an alley beside the cathedral. In daylight she could see him more clearly, and despite the dirt and worn clothing, she noticed things that puzzled her. His teeth were perfectly straight and white, clearly the result of expensive dental care. His hands, though dirty, showed no signs of long-term rough living, no calluses from manual labor or scars from street fights. And when he walked, it was with a confidence that seemed almost regal, as if he was accustomed to people stepping aside for him. "I brought soup," Elena said, offering the thermos, "and a blanket. The nights are getting colder." She studied his face in the better light, noticing the strong jawline and aristocratic features that no amount of grime could disguise. As Alexander accepted these gifts, he struggled with emotions he hadn't felt in years. Growing up in palaces, surrounded by people who catered to his every need because of his title and wealth, he had forgotten what it felt like to receive genuine care. Servants attended to him because they were paid to do so. Nobles courted his favor because they wanted something in return. But Elena asked for nothing, expected nothing, gave freely simply because she saw a need. "Why?" Alexander asked suddenly, his voice rougher than usual. "Why do you help me when everyone else?" He gestured toward the bustling street where people continued to ignore them both. "Because everyone else is wrong," Elena replied firmly, sitting beside him on the steps and unscrewing the thermos cap so the warmth and aroma of the soup filled the air between them. "And because my grandmother used to tell me that we're all just one tragedy away from needing help ourselves. She used to say that kindness is like compound interest. It grows when you invest it in others." Over the following weeks, their morning encounters became routine. Elena would finish her shift, often having worked with premature babies or children with serious illnesses, and spend an hour with Alexander before heading home. She brought food, clothing, and eventually, conversation that revealed pieces of both their souls. Elena told him about her dreams of opening a free clinic for underprivileged children, about how she had seen too many families choose between medical care and basic necessities like food and housing. She spoke about her mother's battle with arthritis that made work impossible, how her mother had once been a seamstress but could no longer hold a needle steady. She talked about the weight of being the sole provider for her family, how she sent half her paycheck home each month and lived on whatever was left. "I was supposed to go to medical school," Elena confided one morning as they shared a breakfast she'd brought. "I had a scholarship, everything was arranged, but when my father died, the medical bills and funeral costs wiped out what little savings we had. My mother couldn't work and someone had to take care of her, so I became a nurse instead. It's good work, important work, but sometimes I wonder what it would have been like to be Dr. Morrow instead of Nurse Morrow." Alexander, carefully choosing his words, told her about his work, advocating for policy changes, and his frustration with people in power who make decisions without understanding their impact. He spoke of feeling isolated by his responsibilities and the weight of others' expectations, though he couldn't reveal the full extent of those responsibilities. "I've spent my whole life in meetings and conferences, listening to statistics and reports," Alexander said one particularly cold morning, as Elena wrapped the blanket around both their shoulders. But numbers on a page don't tell you what it feels like to be hungry or cold or invisible. They don't capture the dignity that people maintain even when society has given up on them. Elena watched him as he spoke, noting the passion in his voice and the way his language became more formal when he talked about policy. "You speak like someone who's used to being listened to," she observed, "like someone whose opinion matters." Alexander met her gaze, startled by her perceptiveness. "Maybe I just care more than I'm supposed to." But it was Elena's colleague, Sarah Chen, who first noticed the changes in her friend. Sarah had been Elena's closest friend since nursing school, and she knew Elena's patterns and moods better than anyone. "You're glowing lately," Sarah observed one evening as they finished their rounds in the pediatric intensive care unit. "And you've been buying extra food every day. Elena, please tell me you're not skipping meals again. You know what happened last time you tried to stretch your budget too thin." Elena hesitated, checking the monitors on their last patient, a 7-year-old boy recovering from heart surgery. She had been spending more money than she could afford, buying food not just for Alexander but for other homeless individuals she'd started noticing. Alexander's situation had opened her eyes to how many people were struggling invisibly in their city, how many people walked past them every day without seeing their humanity. "I'm helping someone," Elena finally admitted as they completed their charting. "A man named Alexander. He's different, Sarah. Intelligent, kind, and there's something about him that doesn't add up. Sometimes when he talks, it's like he's used to being listened to, like he's accustomed to having authority. And the way he speaks, it's not just educated, it's refined in a way that suggests privilege." Sarah's expression grew concerned. "Elena, you have the biggest heart of anyone I know, but you can't save everyone. And you certainly can't afford to. Your mother depends on that money you send home, and you're barely getting by as it is." "I know," Elena said quietly, "but Sarah, you should see the way people look right through him, as if he doesn't exist. And when I give him food, it's not just gratitude I see in his eyes. It's surprise, like he's not used to people being kind without wanting something in return." Sarah softened, recognizing the stubborn compassion that had made Elena such an extraordinary nurse. "Just be careful, Elena. The heart doesn't always see clearly, especially when it's trying to heal someone else's pain." Meanwhile, Alexander was facing his own complications. His absence had been noticed, and his cousin Vincent had taken control of the duchy's day-to-day operations, exactly what Alexander had feared. Vincent had been quick to implement his own agenda, cutting funding for social programs and redirecting resources toward projects that benefited the nobility while ignoring the common people's needs. But more troubling were the private investigators Vincent had hired to find him. Vincent claimed it was out of concern for Alexander's safety, but Alexander suspected his cousin's motivations were far less altruistic. With Alexander gone, Vincent was effectively ruling the duchy, and he was enjoying the power immensely. One evening, as Elena sat with Alexander on a bench in the small park near the cathedral, sharing a meal she'd brought from home and talking about her day at the hospital, a black sedan pulled up nearby. The car was expensive, out of place in this modest neighborhood, and it moved with the purposeful slowness of people conducting surveillance. "Alexander," Elena said, noticing how his entire body had gone rigid, his hand freezing halfway to his mouth with a spoonful of the soup she'd brought. "What's wrong?" "I need to go," he said abruptly, standing up so quickly that the soup spilled across the bench. But it was too late. Two men in expensive suits approached them with the confident stride of people accustomed to being obeyed. They were clearly not local, their clothes and bearing marking them as representatives of wealth and power. "Your Grace," the taller one said formally, his voice carrying the respectful tone reserved for nobility, "the council requires your immediate return." Elena's world tilted on its axis. "Your Grace," she looked between Alexander and the men, confusion and realization warring on her face. "Your Grace" was a title reserved for dukes and duchesses, members of the highest nobility. She felt the ground shift beneath her as she began to understand the magnitude of what she had stumbled into. "Give me a moment," Alexander said to the men, his voice suddenly carrying an authority that made them step back immediately despite their own obvious importance. This was no longer the gentle, grateful man she had been feeding for weeks. This was someone accustomed to command, someone whose word was law. He turned to Elena, seeing the hurt and bewilderment in her eyes, the way her face had gone pale with shock. "Elena, I can explain." "Your Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Alexander, what's going on? Who are you?" "My full name is Alexander James Blackwood," he said quietly, his own voice heavy with regret. "I'm the Duke of Ravenshollow." The silence that followed was deafening. Elena stood slowly, her face cycling through emotions, shock, hurt, and something that looked like betrayal. The magnitude of the deception was crushing. She had been caring for one of the most powerful men in Europe while struggling to pay her own bills. "A duke," she repeated, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You're a duke and you've been what? Playing dress-up, having fun pretending to be homeless while I've been worried sick about you." "No," Alexander said urgently, reaching toward her before stopping himself. "Elena, it's not like that. I've been investigating conditions for legislation, trying to understand what people really face." "While I've been giving you my lunch money," Elena interrupted, her voice growing stronger as the full implications hit her. "While I've been worrying about you sleeping in the cold, you probably have a mansion somewhere, multiple mansions." "I have several," Alexander admitted, and immediately regretted his honesty when Elena's face crumpled with fresh pain. "Elena, please let me explain," he said desperately. "Your Grace," the second investigator interrupted, his voice carrying urgency. "We really must insist. The situation at home has become critical." "I said give me a moment." Alexander's command was so sharp, so imperious, that both men immediately stepped back. This was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question, someone whose authority was absolute and unquestionable. But Elena had heard enough. The transformation in Alexander's voice, the immediate deference of the men, the casual mention of multiple estates, it all painted a picture that made her feel foolish and used. "Don't," she said, backing away from him. "Don't explain, I understand perfectly. I was just part of your little social experiment, wasn't I? The good-hearted nurse who'd feed the fake homeless man. Did you take notes? Was my kindness good research material?" "That's not true," Alexander said desperately, taking a step toward her. "Elena, what we have is real. These weeks with you have been the most genuine I've felt in my entire life." But Elena was already walking away, her nursing bag heavy on her shoulder, her steps quick and determined. "Enjoy your palace, Your Grace," she called back, her voice thick with tears and bitter with disappointment. As the black sedan drove away with Alexander inside, he watched Elena disappear into the morning crowd through the rear window. He could see her shoulders shaking with what he assumed were tears, and the sight cut through him more deeply than any political betrayal ever had. In the back seat, surrounded by luxury he no longer wanted, luxury that now felt like a prison, Alexander realized he had lost the one person who had seen him for who he truly was. Not his title, not his wealth, not his power, but simply as Alexander. And worse, he had hurt the woman whose kindness had reminded him why his work mattered in the first place. The ride back to his estate was conducted in silence. The investigators briefed him on Vincent's activities, the council meetings he had missed, the legislation that had been passed in his absence. But Alexander heard none of it. His mind was filled with images of Elena's face, the way she had looked at him with such disappointment and betrayal. He thought about her small apartment that she had described, about the money she sent to her mother, about the scholarship she had given up to care for her family. 3 weeks passed, and Elena threw herself into work with a determination that worried her colleagues. She picked up extra shifts, worked double weekends, and avoided the route past the cathedral entirely. But no matter how busy she kept herself, she couldn't stop thinking about Alexander's eyes, how they had looked when he told her his real name, filled with something that seemed like genuine pain. "You're going to burn out," Sarah warned one evening as Elena prepared for another double shift, her third that week. "And don't tell me you're fine. You've lost weight, you barely sleep, and you haven't smiled once since whatever happened with your mysterious Alexander." Elena mechanically checked her supplies, avoiding Sarah's concerned gaze. "I'm fine. The children need care and we're short-staffed." "The children need you healthy and functioning, not running on fumes and heartbreak," Sarah replied firmly. "Elena, whatever happened with this man, you can't let it destroy you." Elena's response was interrupted by an urgent page crackling through the hospital speakers. "Multiple casualties incoming," the announcement declared with the calm urgency that meant a major emergency. "All available staff to emergency. ETA 5 minutes. What Elena didn't know was that the emergency was no accident. Vincent Blackwood, now acting as regent in Alexander's absence, had been systematically cutting funding to safety inspections and social services, moves that Alexander's policies had previously prevented. A gas leak in a low-income housing complex had resulted in an explosion that left dozens injured, many of them children. The building should have been inspected months ago, but Vincent had redirected the funds meant for safety inspections to a project that would benefit his wealthy supporters. As Elena rushed to help the incoming patients, she found herself face to face with the consequences of the very political battles Alexander had tried to explain during their conversations. The injured were the working poor, families who couldn't afford to live anywhere safer, people exactly like those Alexander claimed to be fighting for. The first ambulance arrived with a family of 5 parents and 3 children who had been trapped when their apartment building's gas line exploded. Elena immediately took charge of the youngest, a 6-year-old girl with severe burns and smoke inhalation. As she worked to stabilize the child, inserting an IV and administering oxygen, she felt a familiar anger building inside her. This should never have happened. This was the result of someone deciding that profit margins were more important than human lives. But as she worked to save the little girl, Elena had no idea that in the hospital's administrative offices, a very different drama was unfolding. Alexander had arrived unannounced, having received word about the explosion from his remaining loyal contacts in the duchy. Still dressed in simple clothes, he had refused to return to his formal wardrobe after his experience on the streets. He was demanding access to the victims, wanting to personally ensure they received the best care available. "Your Grace," the hospital administrator, Dr. Morrison, said nervously, clearly flustered by the unexpected arrival of nobility in his hospital. "While we appreciate your concern, we have protocols, insurance considerations." "Protocols that I'm overriding," Alexander said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "These people were injured because of policy failures that occurred in my absence. Their care is my responsibility, and I want the best specialists available brought in immediately, regardless of cost." It was then that Alexander saw her, Elena, emerging from trauma room 3, her scrubs stained with blood and soot, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. She was pulling off surgical gloves, her hair escaping from its ponytail, and she looked like she had been through a battle. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the busy hallway, the chaos of the emergency department swirling around them. Elena's first instinct was to turn away, but something in Alexander's expression stopped her. He looked broken. This wasn't the composed duke or even the mysterious man she'd fed on the streets. This was someone carrying the weight of real consequences, someone who understood that his absence had cost lives. Before either could speak, Sarah Chen appeared beside Elena, her own scrubs similarly stained. "Elena, they need you in trauma too. There's a little boy asking for his mother and she's..." Sarah's voice trailed off as she noticed the tension between Elena and the well-dressed man standing with Dr. Morrison. "Is that him?" Sarah whispered, recognizing the pain in her friend's eyes. "The guy from the streets." Elena nodded, unable to speak. Seeing Alexander here in her workplace, surrounded by the consequences of political decisions, made the betrayal feel fresh and raw again. It was then that Vincent Blackwood made his appearance, sweeping into the hospital with an entourage of political advisors and security personnel. Where Alexander traveled simply, Vincent moved like a man who believed the world should rearrange itself for his convenience. His clothes were immaculate, his manner imperious, and his expression showed no concern for the human tragedy unfolding around him. "Alexander," Vincent called out, his voice carrying just enough warmth to seem familial while his eyes remained cold and calculating. "How wonderful that you're taking such personal interest in this tragedy, though I do hope you're not planning another one of your field expeditions. The duchy has been running quite smoothly in your absence." The threat in Vincent's words was subtle but unmistakable, a reminder that Alexander's authority had been superseded, and that Vincent was now firmly in control. Alexander's jaw tightened as he recognized the political maneuvering behind his cousin's seemingly innocent words. Elena, despite her hurt and anger toward Alexander, found herself paying attention to the interaction between the two men. Something about Vincent's manner felt wrong, predatory almost, like a snake preparing to strike. There was no genuine concern in his voice, no acknowledgement of the human suffering around them. "Vincent," Alexander replied carefully, his own voice measured and diplomatic. "I trust you'll be investigating how a building that was supposed to undergo safety inspections last month was allowed to remain operational." "These things happen," Vincent said with a shrug that made Elena's stomach turn. "Budget constraints, you understand. We can't save everyone. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good of the duchy." The callousness of the statement hit Elena like a physical blow. She had just spent 2 hours trying to save the life of a 6-year-old girl whose burns covered 30% of her body. These weren't numbers to Vincent, they were people, families, children she was currently fighting to save. And suddenly, Alexander's words from weeks ago came flooding back, his frustration with people in power who make decisions without understanding their impact. "Excuse me," Elena found herself saying, stepping forward despite every instinct telling her to stay away from this confrontation. Both men turned to look at her, Alexander with surprise and something that looked like hope, Vincent with cool appraisal. "Are you saying that budget concerns were more important than safety inspections that might have prevented this?" Vincent's eyes narrowed as he took in Elena's appearance, the tired nurse with blood on her clothes and fire in her eyes. His expression shifted, becoming predatory as he recognized a potential weakness in Alexander's armor. "And you are?" "Elena Morau," she said, lifting her chin defiantly despite the exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. "I'm treating the children who were hurt because of those budget constraints you mentioned." "Ms. Morau," Vincent said smoothly, his voice taking on a condescending tone that made Elena's skin crawl. "I understand you're emotional, but these are complex political matters that require careful consideration of multiple factors." "There's nothing complex about a 6-year-old girl with third-degree burns," Elena interrupted, her voice growing stronger as her anger overcame her fear. "There's nothing complex about families who lost everything because someone decided their lives weren't worth the cost of an inspection." Alexander watched this exchange with growing amazement and something that felt like pride. Here was Elena, exhausted, heartbroken, with every reason to avoid him and this situation, standing up to one of the most powerful men in the country because she couldn't stand to see injustice dismissed so casually. Even in her anger toward him, her fundamental character remained unchanged. "Alexander," Vincent said warningly, his mask of civility beginning to slip, "perhaps you should escort Ms. Morau back to her duties before she says something she might regret." But Elena wasn't done. The injustice of the situation, the casual disregard for human life, and yes, her anger at being deceived all combined to fuel her courage. "Actually, I'd like to know something, Your Grace," she said, looking directly at Alexander. "All those conversations we had about policy and change and helping people, was any of that real? Because right now, I'm looking at two dukes, and only one of them seems to actually care about the people whose lives hang in the balance." The silence that followed was electric. Vincent's face had gone pale, then red, as he realized that this nurse had somehow gained intimate knowledge of Alexander's political views. Dr. Morrison looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, and Alexander looked at Elena as if she were the most magnificent thing he'd ever seen. "It was all real," Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying a conviction that cut through the political posturing. "Every word. And Ms. Morau is right, one of us does care about these people more than political convenience." Vincent's mask finally slipped completely. "How dare you question my commitment to the duchy? While you were playing in the gutter, I was maintaining order, making the hard decisions that leadership requires." "You were cutting services that kept people alive," Alexander interrupted, his own voice growing harder. "You were proving exactly why I needed to understand what our policies actually meant to real people." "Real people like your little nurse here." Vincent's smile was cruel now, and Elena felt a chill run down her spine as she realized she had become a weapon in whatever game these two men were playing. "How touching, though I do wonder what she thinks about being part of your social experiment." Elena's face went white as the words hit home, and Alexander stepped forward, his voice dangerously low. "Careful, Vincent." But Vincent had found his weapon, and he intended to use it to its full effect. "You didn't tell her, did you, about the reports you've been filing? About how her kindness provided such interesting insights into the psychology of poverty? About how useful her reactions were for understanding the mindset of the working class?" Elena looked between them, confusion and growing horror on her face. "Reports." Alexander's heart was racing as he saw the trap closing around him. "Elena, it's not what he's making it sound like." "Oh, but it is," Vincent continued, his voice dripping with full sympathy. "Every interaction, every conversation, all documented for the duchy's social policy research. Tell her, Alexander. Tell her about the paragraph you wrote about how authentic human compassion provided invaluable data on effective intervention strategies." Elena's world tilted as the full magnitude of the deception became clear. The reports were real. Alexander had been required to document his findings as part of his investigation. But Vincent was twisting the truth, making it sound clinical and manipulative, when Alexander's feelings for Elena had been anything but. Elena, Alexander said desperately, yes, I was documenting what I learned, but not about you, never about you personally. The reports were about systemic issues, about policy failures. But I was in them, Elena said, her voice barely a whisper. I was data. No, Alexander said urgently, moving toward her. You were never data to me. Elena, you were the one real thing in all of this. But Elena was backing away again, just like she had weeks ago, the betrayal cutting deeper this time because now she understood the full scope of what had been hidden from her. I need to get back to work, she said, her voice becoming stronger as her professional training kicked in. People are depending on me, real people, not research subjects. As she turned to go, Vincent played his final card, the one he had been saving for maximum impact. Ms. Morrow, he called out sweetly, his voice carrying a false concern that made Elena's skin crawl. I do hope your mother's medical bills aren't becoming too burdensome. It would be such a shame if your financial stress affected your work here at the hospital. Elena froze, her blood turning to ice. How did he know about her mother? She had never mentioned her mother's medical situation to anyone except Alexander during their conversations by the cathedral. Alexander's voice was deadly quiet when he spoke. Vincent, what did you just say? Oh, Vincent said, feigning surprise with theatrical precision. Didn't you know? I've taken quite an interest in Ms. Morrow since learning of her connection to your research. Amazing what a financial background check can reveal. Nursing school debt, mortgage assistance for an elderly parent, all on a nurse's salary. Admirable really, though I imagine rather stressful. The threat was clear as crystal. Elena's livelihood, her mother's care, everything could be destroyed with a single phone call from Vincent. Elena understood immediately. This wasn't just about her relationship with Alexander anymore. This was about power, control, and the willingness to destroy innocent lives for political gain. Alexander understood too, and in that moment, looking at Elena's pale face and seeing the calculation in Vincent's eyes, he realized that his cousin had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The hospital corridor fell silent except for the distant sounds of emergency treatment continuing in the trauma units. Elena stood frozen, the full weight of Vincent's threat sinking in like poison. Alexander could see her mind racing, calculating risks, considering consequences, doing exactly what Vincent wanted her to do. But Alexander had learned something crucial during his weeks on the streets, something that had nothing to do with policy research, and everything to do with the woman now standing between two powerful men who wanted to use her as a weapon against each other. Elena, Alexander said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension, look at me. When she did, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her jaw was set with a determination that reminded him why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. This was the same woman who had given her last sandwich to a stranger, who had stood up to Vincent Blackwood without knowing who he was, who fought for children every day regardless of their ability to pay. Vincent, Alexander said, not taking his eyes off Elena, you've just made a critical error. Have I? Vincent laughed, his confidence absolute. I think I've made my position quite clear. Ms. Morrow understands the delicate nature of her situation. You've revealed exactly who you are, Alexander continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. And you've given me everything I need to remove you from the Regency permanently. For the first time, Vincent's confident expression flickered, uncertainty creeping into his eyes. You have no grounds. Threatening a civilian, using private financial information to intimidate someone, cutting safety inspections that directly led to today's casualties. Alexander's voice was growing stronger with each word, the authority of his position finally asserting itself. I have grounds, Vincent, I have more than grounds. But it was Elena who spoke next, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks, despite the fear she must have been feeling. Do your worst, she said to Vincent, her voice clear and unwavering. Fire me, ruin my credit, whatever you think you can do, but you know what? I've been poor before and I'll be poor again if that's what it takes. At least I'll be able to sleep at night knowing I didn't let you intimidate me into silence. Alexander felt something break open in his chest, not painful but overwhelming, like a dam bursting. This woman, this incredible woman who had every reason to protect herself, was choosing to stand against corruption even when it would cost her everything. She was choosing integrity over safety, justice over security, exactly as she had done every day of her life. Elena, he started, his voice thick with emotion. No, she said firmly, turning to face him fully. Let me finish. I don't know what's real between us and I don't know if I can trust you yet, but I know what's right. And what's right is making sure that man," she pointed at Vincent, "never gets to treat human lives as acceptable losses again." Vincent's face had gone from confident to cold, his mask of civility completely abandoned now. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, little nurse. I have connections that could destroy you, that could." "Could what?" came a new voice from down the hallway. Dr. Morrison approached with two other people, a woman in a business suit carrying a recording device, and a man with a camera. Elena recognized them as local news media, probably following up on the explosion story. "Mr. Blackwood," the woman said to Vincent, her voice professional and direct, "I'm Sarah Mills from Channel 7 News. We've been investigating the recent budget cuts to safety inspections. We'd like to get your comment on today's explosion and whether it could have been prevented." Vincent's confident facade cracked completely, his face going pale as he realized the implications. "I have no comment, and this is private property." "Actually," Dr. Morrison interrupted, his voice steady despite the obvious nervousness he felt at contradicting such powerful people, "I invited them here. As Chief of Staff, I felt the public deserved to know how policy decisions affected patient safety." Elena realized she was witnessing something unprecedented. People in positions of power were choosing to do what was right instead of what was safe. Dr. Morrison was risking his position by inviting media scrutiny. The news team was pursuing a story that implicated powerful people. And Alexander was staring at her with an expression she'd never seen before, something that looked like wonder. "Elena," he said quietly, stepping closer while Vincent tried to extract himself from the media attention, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you decide anything about us." Vincent made a move toward the exit, but Alexander's voice stopped him. "Stay, Vincent, you should hear this too." Elena nodded, exhaustion and adrenaline warring in her system, but her resolve remained firm. "The reports I filed were real," Alexander began, his voice clear and honest. "But Vincent lied about their contents. I never wrote about your kindness as data, I wrote about my own transformation. I documented how spending time with someone who saw past titles and status taught me what leadership actually meant." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper, worn from being carried close to his heart. "This is from my final report, written the day before Vincent's men found me." He handed it to Elena. "Read it, please." With shaking hands, Elena unfolded the document. The letterhead read Official Ducal Policy Review, but the content was unlike any official report she'd ever imagined. "The most significant finding of this investigation is not statistical or economic, but personal. Through the kindness of individuals who chose compassion over convenience, I have learned that effective governance requires not just understanding policy outcomes, but understanding the human spirit that persists despite systemic failures. I have met citizens who share their last meal with strangers, who see dignity where others see burden, who fight for justice without expectation of reward. These are not subjects to be studied, but leaders to be learned from. Recommendation: all future policy decisions should be measured not by fiscal efficiency but by this standard. Do they honor the character of people like Elena Moro, who choose kindness even when it costs them everything? Personal note: I have fallen completely in love with a woman who will never know she taught a duke what nobility truly means." Elena looked up from the paper, tears flowing freely now, her heart racing as she understood the depth of what Alexander had been feeling during those weeks they spent together. "I love you," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "Not because you helped a homeless man, not because you fit into some social experiment, but because you're the strongest, most compassionate person I've ever known. You've shown me that real nobility has nothing to do with titles or wealth or power. You've shown me what it means to be truly noble." Behind them, the reporter was recording everything, capturing what would become one of the most watched news segments of the year. Vincent stood trapped, unable to leave without looking guilty, unable to speak without incriminating himself further. "But Elena," Alexander continued, his voice becoming vulnerable in a way she had never heard from him, "I won't ask you to love me back. I won't ask you to accept the complications my position would bring to your life. I'm just asking for a chance to prove that everything I feel for you is real." Elena looked at the man before her, really looked at him, not the Duke, not the homeless stranger, but Alexander. The same Alexander who had thanked her for a simple sandwich as if she'd given him the world. The same one who had listened to her dreams without judgment, who had spoken about justice with genuine passion, who had cried when she told him about her father's death. "The first day we met," Elena said slowly, her voice growing stronger, You asked me why I helped when everyone else ignored you. Do you remember what I said? Because everyone else was wrong. Elena nodded. They were wrong about you being worthless because you appeared homeless, and maybe I was wrong about you being worthless because you appeared powerful. She took a deep breath, making a decision that would change both their lives forever. I don't know how to love a duke, but I think I could learn to love Alexander. The kiss that followed was witnessed by hospital staff, a news crew, and a thoroughly defeated Vincent Blackwood. But Alexander and Elena noticed none of it. They were too busy discovering that sometimes the most unlikely love stories are the ones that change everything. 6 months later, the gas explosion had led to comprehensive safety reform throughout the duchy. Vincent Blackwood was under investigation for corruption, misappropriation of funds, and criminal negligence. Elena had received a full scholarship to complete her medical training, funded by the duchy's new healthcare initiative that Alexander had finally been able to implement. Alexander had proposed to her in the same place they'd met, on the cathedral steps, with a simple band and a promise that their love would always be measured not by titles or status, but by the simple choice to see each other's worth. The wedding was held in the cathedral, attended by both nobility and the people from the streets who had come to know Alexander during his time among them. Elena kept working as a nurse even after becoming a duchess, opening the free clinic she had always dreamed of. Alexander reformed the duchy's approach to social services, ensuring that policy decisions were made by people who understood their real-world impact. And if you ever find yourself walking past that cathedral, you might still see them there sometimes. A duke and his duchess who learned that the truest nobility isn't inherited, but earned through everyday acts of compassion. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that kindness truly can change everything, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to remember that love often comes disguised as unexpected opportunities to care for one another.